This is Mobius, more inside-out conversations and discussions with Robert Monroe, author of Journeys Out of the Body and Far Journeys, two popular books based on Mr. Monroe's personal explorations into other realities beyond the ordinary human experience. Mr. Monroe is also the founder of the Monroe Institute, a research and educational organization dedicated to the investigation of unusual aspects of human consciousness. With Mr. Monroe is David Wallace, engineer and project director for the Institute.
Anyway, living that whole beautiful experience. Well, that was my first takeoff, as it were. Anyway, I got back to my aunt's house, and this was, say, about lunchtime, and I was home for lunch, so what they would say, they weren't worried about anything, about where I'd been or whatever. But my mother says, "Bob Allen, your wife is a ghost. What happened? Are you all right?" You know, medical doctor looking at her the son. I says, "No, I'm fine." And anyway, after slightly prodding, because I didn't really want to release this or hold back this exciting thing that happened, I told her, and she accepted it without any anxiety or worry. It was sort of after the fact, but she wasn't worried about my going up in an airplane. She had a reaction at first, and then she realized, well, that's it or whatever. In other words, there wasn't any rebuke or anything else. She says, "Well, come on and eat," that type of thing.
Bob, one of the interesting things that I seem to note as a pattern throughout your life and descriptions of what you're doing, your parents almost actively encouraged you to go out and do your own thing, even though the terminology wasn't used back then.
Yes, the question of encouragement is perhaps a misnomer. It was not vigorous encouragement, but it was not even permissive. It was giving a point of freedom, and as long as I didn't abuse that freedom, I was in good shape. And I never thought of it this way either, I might add it, but I didn't feel restrictions, that's true. That freedom was expressed in, one, if I, quote, paid the price, when the price was very cheap, if I did my chores, A, B, if I got home in time for the meals, which meant lunch or dinner, I was relatively free. And I might add there was another freedom that was there, and in looking over this early childhood, I did not have a heavy religious indoctrination that I had to either change or examine or whatever, and that was a freedom. It was a freedom that I didn't have to unload a heavy belief system. In checking again, the only time, for example, having become a member of that church, and in order to be musical, one of the things you got for becoming a member of the church was a small black-bound copy of the New Testament, not the Old Testament, just the New Testament. Remember, this is Christian, and I read that very carefully, and I read it several times. But in our home, and I had to verify this with my sister Dorothy, we never had a Bible. There wasn't a Bible prominently sitting in the living room or whatever. It just isn't there. I obviously then later, in later years, in high school or somewhere, read the whole Bible a number of times, but more out of curiosity than anything else. But that freedom of choice was there even as a little child, and it was great. As long as I didn't get into any trouble, and they didn't even say what trouble was, and they didn't even mention getting into trouble. And the interesting part is that in that child era, I did not get into any trouble, although I took some and did some things that I very prudently did not tell my parents about. And the reason I didn't tell them is when I suspected that they then would clamp a lid on it. One of them being, for example, that somehow, and this is back in a part of me that I don't understand, I have a great attraction for trains and tracks. So I was lured to the C&O train yards, which was about 3 miles from where we lived. And I just liked to be there and liked to watch the cars, freight cars being moved from one place to another, and the switchers being worked, and all this kind of thing. And I wandered through this yard and not thinking it was a dangerous thing. And I suppose I think my parents did eventually learn I had been there, and they didn't know how incredibly dangerous it was for a kid to be in a train yard. But I never had any major close call at all. And I'm crawling under freight cars, you know, and across the tracks and climbing on couplers and over the top of cars and this kind of thing. And I never had anything remotely resembling a close call. And even I got over into the roundhouse, which is a roundhouse, half-round house with a turntable in front of it where locomotives, steam locomotives would come on the turntable and be rotated into a stall. And I must have been far more gregarious than I thought I was, because I got to know these engineer characters and these wipers, which are guys who clean up locomotives, because they didn't chase me out. Here I'm a kid wandering all over their territory, and they didn't chase me out. I'd climb up in these engines. They knew that I wouldn't mistakenly pull a lever and make the engine go or something like that, and I didn't. I never even tried it. The result was that I got to ride around in these locomotives as they pulled them out of the roundhouse, go down the turntable, rotate out, and they'd park it way over here, or go pick up a cut of cars, and I'd ride in it. It was a great, great thing to ride that big locomotive. It's how these things begin to tie together in one's life as one goes along. And there's more to that, and what that early train experience paid off. I can give you a clue. That plus another experience in college paid off for me immensely in New York City. I must have made $500,000 from that knowledge, because all the way skipped ahead to my New York days, and I did a serial on network radio called Rocky Gordon, which was all about trains and freight trains. And because of that knowledge and some other I picked up when I was in college, it ran for 4 years. And it was in what we call super prime time even, and that was on NBC, red and blue, immediately preceding Lowell Thomas and Amos and Andy, which were the key block. So it was a very, very widely heard show. But that all came from that early knowledge. Well, and then, of course, I had some other types of adventures, reading everything from sea stories, but the ocean was over there somewhere, and reading things like Tom Sawyer. But we had caves, and if you ever read Tom Sawyer, you know his cave exploration. Well, Lexington and the area around there is loaded with, it's a limestone country, and there's an awful lot of caves because limestone erodes very well. We used to explore caves. This, not Harry, but another boy and I. Harry was too much of a sophisticate to go walk around in dark caves, but this other boy and I did it. And we went all the way back into this Picadome cave, which was only about 2 miles outside of Lexington. And you went in the cave, and it got smaller and smaller. And then you got to an end, and then there was a crevice, and you had to walk or crawl or slide through on your belly about 50 feet down in an arch, and then up again. And you're in this beautiful big cavern with stalactites and stalagmites and everything else like that. But most people wouldn't take this run down through this wallow snake on your belly down through all this rock, because this is a spooky kind of thing, because it's that close you could barely make it at times. And but we did, and we had the kite string to let us know how to get back, just in Tom Sawyer. We went down through that underground crevice thing and came up into this beautiful place. And of course, as happens, your flashlights run out, but we were smart enough. We brought along old wood matches, so we had enough lights. And that cave went on and on. There had been others who had gone beyond that beautiful cavern, but we were about not quite a mile into the cave at that time. And that's the type of stuff that we did. And there were a lot of such caves along the Kentucky River that were other parts of exploration. But I never felt claustrophobic in that. And I shoot ahead a ways to give you an idea. I have to skip around to make points, because caves and the sense of claustrophobia. Years later, up in Dutchess County, where I had a farmhouse, the well went dry. And in order to find out what was the matter. I could have done it another way, but it was a dug well. It wasn't a drilled well, which meant it was about 3 feet in diameter, and it was lined with rock all the way down. And so I thought, well, heck, I'll go down in the well and see what's in it, not thinking anything other than the fact that, well, I'll go down and find out whether I need to, if it's really gone dry, or I need to extend a pipe. The best way is to go down. So I laid a rope over in it, and the typical thing, you know, what they call it, rappelling or whatever, down in the well. And it was about 70 feet down. I got down in there, and I'm looking, and sure enough, there's water. There's water. All I had to do was, in turn, drop the pipe maybe a foot, and then I would have the pipes back in the water. The flow had gotten down to there. Then I looked back up, and here's this little tiny circle of light way up there. And here I am down in this well, this deep well, way here. And daylight's just a little circle way up above. And all of a sudden I got this terrible squeezed-in feeling. There's claustrophobia. All of these rocks, they've been there for 100 years. Suppose I just slides one, the whole well's going to cave in on me while I'm down there.
And you're thinking, what am I doing here?
Yeah, what am I doing down here? This strange feeling. And I started to get up, and then I thought, well, I better get me a sip of the water for it. So I take a handful of water, and then I sip the water. And I think it was with that sip that something changed. I looked back up. The whole pattern changed. How did the pattern change? And maybe it was remembering the cave days. I don't know. But all of a sudden, I know I didn't feel it as a child, but this great sense of peace came over me. And the peace came because it had something to do with being in Mother Earth. It was the warmth, the friendliness of that earth, down in the earth that way. It was great peace came over me. And I was in an era where I didn't even think about consciousness and all this kind of thing or what. But there was that feeling of being very much not at home, but in the womb. I don't know. It was almost just a tremendously peaceful thing. And I stayed down there for about 2 hours, just savoring that wonderful feeling of what it was to be down 70-plus feet in that well. And then I climbed and got up and out, fixed the pipe, and that was it. But it was the feeling of that moment. And did that start back as a kid investigating caves without any fear? I don't know. But I was definitely claustrophobic in that well.
The nice thing, when you stop and look at it, your parents never instilled a sense of fear in you about don't do this, that, and the other. They allowed you to go ahead and experience these things for yourself.
Don't misunderstand. They didn't because they didn't know I was doing them. There's a difference. I'm sure if they had been aware, they may not have stopped me from doing the cave stuff, but they would have cautioned me very much about it at the least. They would not have, I don't think, because I did mention the train yards, but they didn't know the dangers of it. If they had known the dangers, I'm sure that they would have banned me from doing that kind of thing. It's just a common knowledge that I didn't think they would approve of certain things. As a child, were there any other unusual events? Well, yes, unusual and usual. I can give you a usual event, but I had perhaps an unusual response. I remember when I first discovered there was no Santa Claus, which was probably before I was 4 years old. And how I discovered this was that traditionally that the curtains would be drawn in the living room or sitting room, as they might be called. And that's where Santa Claus would come that night, the day before Christmas Eve, and it was all be closed. And I remember going around, and this is how I discovered there was no Santa Claus. I remember the day before Christmas where those blinds were drawn, and my curiosity overcoming my prudence, and I peeked through a hole in the blind, and I saw my mother and my older sister Dorothy arranging the tree and all the presents. And I said, And it was not any more than that. There wasn't any great despondence or disillusionment. I thought, so that's how it works. You know, the mechanical mind says how could it all come down the chimney, and any other particular event. One was that I had scarlet fever as a kid back in those early days, 7 years old, something like that. And in that, all my memory of it is only the part where I was not in school, but was walking around in the back and couldn't go anywhere, and wearing dark glasses. I was told later that in order to save my life, they had to use an untested antitoxin for scarlet fever, and that is the one that did save my life, was this untested antitoxin, which had some kind of side effects, but not any severe or significant ones. Incidentally, speaking of that, you remember this was another era where if there was any contagious disease, a house was quarantined. A big sign was pounded on the front door, big red letters, quarantined. And that meant if there's measles, chickenpox, or something like that, you couldn't go in and out of the house. It was subject to a fine or any sort of. So here's this big quarantine thing. And I know that during what they call the contagious period, my sisters couldn't be there, and I think it was my father did not come home during this contagious period simply because it wasn't Board of Health wouldn't let it happen. Another thing is that of somewhere within that prior 10 years and under, 11 years and under, I was in the front yard of our house. And just as this thunderstorm was coming up, and the power pole, 30, 40 feet away from me, got hit by lightning, and it stunned me. And in other words, I, quote, lost consciousness. And the next point that I remember, I was up on the porch of the house instead of out in the grass. And that was one event. There was one little final thing, and that was that and again, in that same era, I couldn't tell you how old, if I was old enough to be a caddy at a golf course. And I was a Class C caddy, and that means I was pretty young when I was doing it. But I was out on the golf course one time, and I was with, this usual foursome or whatever. And I looked up in the sky, and here was this huge teardrop of fire came down out of the sky and didn't come onto the ground, but made a loop and went all the way up and back out again. In other words, and this was in a clear sky. It wasn't cloudy, and it was absolutely clear sky. And all of a sudden, this huge yellow fiery teardrop thing came out, and and went back up and disappeared, going upward again. Did not fall. And I yelled out when I saw this, and the rest of the foursome saw this yellow, flaming thing come out of the sky. And in discussing that later, because it wasn't just one kid seeing it, these other people, golfers saw it and the other caddies, that nobody could really explain what it was, because if it had come on down, it could have been a meteor, just a live meteor coming in. But the arch was there and went on back up. And as afterthought, I came on excitingly telling my parents about it, and they knew one of the golfers, and they called him, and he verified it. I remember that. And I was telling a big story. He said, "No, I'm not telling a big story." It wasn't. So my father very methodically called up and said, "My son said this. Did you see it?" And he saw it. But that's the idea. A meteor would fall to Earth. This turned around and went back up. No answer. One of those things that happens in one's life.
Interesting. I gather by a lot of the stories and what you've done in your life that you're not a sissy. What about you and your interest in girls?
Oh, well, that's an obvious answer to that. Is that no, I was certainly not classified as a sissy, and it wasn't just my ability to box; it was the things I liked to do. But I did run into the accusation of being a sissy as a kid, and it came because I liked little girls. Now, I was attracted to little girls, and I defiantly wanted to express that by being with little girls. And little boys didn't do that in those days, and they would be called sissies. this is where the boxing came out nicely, in the sense that I could, anybody that called me a sissy, I said, well, you want to prove it, in kid language, and he'd often turn to that. So then I respectfully could carry a girl's books home from school if I wanted to. And this is one of those interesting things, that one thing I could do. I recognized the difference between a girl and a boy very early, and that difference was very attractive to me, no question about it. And I make no apologies, because that's what we're supposed to be, is have that innocence. It isn't something you're not supposed to have. This is something you're supposed to have. And I had it, and I could go on and on about it, but I do have to relate one particular kid story because it's so unbeatable. I mentioned Harry, my childhood friend, and of course we got into a lot of kid discussions about sex. You've got to remember that my total sex education consisted of my father when I was out helping him in his garden, which was his big hobby. And we were in a potato patch, and I saw 2 potato bugs, one on top of the other. And I asked, Daddy, what's that? And he says, they are reproducing. I says, well, how do they do that? And he holds up the potato bugs with one still on top of the other. And I see them as they are locked in together. And I says, is that how? He says, yes, that's how. That was my total education in terms of sex. So the rest I learned in the typical way, which is here and there and around the corner. Anyway, Harry Bullock and I got into a lot of discussions about sex. And the turnaround on that was that Harry had a cousin, a very attractive, quote, little girl. And we're 10 years old, maybe 11, somewhere in there. And so we rigged it so that I was going to have sex with this cousin, and we were right up front about it. Whether she was came in from Barberville, Kentucky, on summer visits, and we were right up front about it. We didn't kid her about it. We want to have sex, and I'm your cousin, so I can't do it. But Bob here is not your cousin, so he can do it, because that's all part of the mystique. She says, all right. So we went up into this room over the garage, and Harry's waiting nice and discreetly down here to see how it happens, how it works out. So we go up into this room on the bar, and here's it's sort of like a servant's quarter or something. It's not being used, and we stand. I'm standing around. She's standing around. She's roses, and she says, well, what do we do next? I says, I don't know. And we're standing there, and she was a pretty girl. I remember I had subsequently wrote some very violent love letters to her down in Barberville, Kentucky. But so we stand there and we're thinking, well, what will we do? How do we do it? We try to think these things out. We had absolutely no experience nor whatever. We'd heard about it. We didn't know how to do anything, whatever. And I was not having any male response, such as my genitals weren't saying anything to me. I was too young. Anyway, so finally, we thought, we can't be up here all this time and disappoint poor cousin Harry. So we agreed that when we went down, we just would say that we did it. So we rearranged our clothes so it looked like we'd taken our clothes off. And then we marched down with this proud expression. And Harry said, how'd it go? How was it? What was it like? And we looked at each other with this smug look, Harriet and I. Said, fine. He said, oh. It wasn't until years later that I told him that it was not so. That's not the way it was. And he enjoyed it. But he was so impressed. Oh, my. His estimation of me went up miles as a result of that particular event.
You gained some status there.
Really status. Speaking of status, one other final thing. When I'm 11 years old, which is sort of the Cub Scout status, although they did let 11-year-olds at that time in as a Boy Scout. And this particular Scoutmaster, after you joined the troop, and he was a very nice, pleasant man, and had no particular outward signs of this, and the parents all liked him very much, men, husbands, my father's included. But this particular scoutmaster had, when you went out to scout camp, he would select a little boy to keep him warm, or to keep the boy warm, whichever excuse, whatever. Or he would ask certain of his special little boys to stay after scout meeting because he wanted them to help clean up the place or something like that. Anyway, and we all giggled because we knew what was going on. We didn't think it's terrible or whatever. In other words, we didn't think of, oh, this is atrocious. So it was just sort of part of the world. And it's funny how kids will accept something like that. And a part of it is we didn't want to get the scoutmaster in trouble. We all liked him.
For the continuation of this Mobius conversation, turn the cassette tape to the other side.
Oh, this is atrocious. So it was just sort of part of the world. And it's funny how kids will accept something like that. And a part of it is we didn't want to get the scoutmaster in trouble. We all liked him. Anyway, add a factor to that. One of the things that kids wanted very badly were newspaper routes, because they were nice money makers. But all the college boys had the local newspaper routes, so only kids under 11 and under could get were what they called the out-of-town routes, which was, say, the Louisville Courier-Journal, which is the one I was familiar with. And anyway, I got one of these routes to deliver papers on weekends. And one of them led through, and that's why I got it, because nobody else really wanted it particularly, went through a black part of town, a black area where blacks lived, the segregated part. I had nobody else had any comments about it either. But it didn't pay as well as the other ones. That's the other part. But I had it. And in the middle of this black part of town was a large house where a bunch of white women lived. And I was always wondered what all these white women were doing in this black part of the community. And also they were good customers. They bought 4 or 5 Courier journals. And so it was a good valued customer. And I always wondered how they always took their money out of their shoes, which is quite a surprising thing to me. They'd keep money in a shoe. You know, these incongruities of what's going on. So finally I asked one of my more knowing friends, and he says, oh, that's a whorehouse. And I said, well, what's doing back up there? I says, I don't know. He says, well, that's where they often are, is back there, because out of sight of the respectable people. He didn't say it that way, but that's the point. And so I said, oh, well. And so I became more curious as to these various female types that would come out, and I'd look at them with a different perspective. You see, these being whores, and what did a whore look? And that's when I got my first look at a whore, what a whore looked like. Interesting part. One morning, delivering the Courier Journal, this is where it all ties together, to that whorehouse. I was just coming around the corner, and I saw the front gate open out of the whorehouse. And who's coming out that Sunday morning but our scoutmaster? And he didn't see me, but I thought, boy, I thought he liked little boys. Here he was coming out of there. And I never told him, but I really speculated on, not at that time, but later, what a wonderful novel it would make if that scoutmaster, in turn, had collected syphilis out of the whorehouse and had disseminated it among these little boys in his troop. What a story that would have made. And may someday, I may just get bored and write it. But I thought that's a fascinating concept of the way things were then. Because, again, you remember that you had, in those days, there was no cure for syphilis. And this was brought very much to the foreground because there was a man in Lexington who had no nose. He only had some holes and nostrils in a flat face and no nose that had been eaten away by syphilis. And that was a real lesson. If you didn't want any no's, man, watch out. And that's what was one of the big things of that whole, it went on for years even after that there was no effective cure. It was much like AIDS is today, that syphilis would go underground and stay there for years and come up and kill you, that kind of thing, very much. So that's a long way to explain how the sex part took place in terms of that early phase of my life. Oh yes, there were some fascinating little ends. One of the parts being that the first time I ever saw a girl in school with silk stockings, wearing silk stockings, I was astounded. She was a pretty girl, but there's something that the silk stockings did. You gotta see how culture knows these things. Anyway, and all the other girls resented her, I might add. Of course, there's another part of one's life one's early life that you cannot ignore. And that, of course, are relatives. And one of my most famous relatives is, and I always speak of him very lovingly, is my father's older brother, his name was Charlie, our Uncle Charlie. I think everybody should have an Uncle Charlie in their life. This Uncle Charlie of mine, mind you, he was 12 years older than my father. He had this tremendous energy, drive, even so, and he pushed my father unmercifully in terms of, my father would say, "Oh, I'm too tired, not tonight." He says, "What do you mean? I'm 12 years older. Come on, let's go." This kind of thing. And Dad didn't have many good answers for that, but they got into more sorts of things. Uncle Charlie would suddenly appear without any advance notice or anything, and appear at the house. And Uncle Charlie was a jack of all trades. He just enjoyed life immensely. I think at one time he showed up with a ukulele, and he played a ukulele and sang. He's a big guy. He had worked a lot in construction, and as a carpenter, a mason, these kinds of things. Great different patterns. And a wonderful storyteller, and sandy-haired, rugged-faced character with a big jovial laugh on him. And we all, obviously, all of us kids, we loved this character. He'd just show up out of nowhere. And the interesting part was that my mother enjoyed him immensely, too. In other words, if he just suddenly showed up, she didn't get disturbed at that at all. And she was very fond of Uncle Charlie. But that older brother was really a hail fellow, well-met type. Mind you, he was not sophisticated, but he was very, very real. And some of the things that he did with us were just great. He would take, for example, when he came in town, we knew we were going to see movies. So on a Saturday, our Uncle Charlie would take me and my two sisters. Emmett was too young, if he even existed at that time. And we'd go down to a Saturday afternoon movie. And Uncle Charlie, by the way, drive us in. He came in with his kind of car, some kind of car. So he had transportation, all this. We go into a movie, and we sit in the movie, and promptly in the darkened movie house, Uncle Charlie would fall asleep. And he'd start snoring. We'd have to push him a little bit and keep from snoring too loud. And he'd fall asleep. And we're all watching the movie. We'll watch it, and we'd wait, and it was the same old cyclical movie. This is where I came in. And we wake up Uncle Charlie and say at the end of it, "This is where we came in, Uncle Charlie. Let's go. It's time to go." "Oh, yeah, fine. We go. And we would see 3 movies in an afternoon, one after another. And Uncle Charlie would sleep through all of them, you see. And we had a great time. So you can imagine what Uncle Charlie meant to us. And nothing would do after that. We went to the drugstore and got all sodas, So this is gala stuff for 3 kids. You can believe we greeted this man. But he did some things with my father. For example, I remember one time Uncle Charlie showed on the scene, and my father had just bought a brand new Dodge touring car. And we're talking about 1925 or something like this. And Uncle Charlie says, "Let's go out and see what she'll do." An hour and a half, 2 hours later, they come back, and the car is somewhere. They've blown the engine on it. That type of thing. And here's my father, real disgruntled, because it was his brand new car, and Uncle Charlie just wanted to see what it would do.
That really made his afternoon.
And other kinds of things like that. So there was that periodic, unexpected visit of an Uncle Charlie who would just meant so much to it. And the fact is, as I say, that here's my mother with an MD degree, and here's this down-to-earth guy, and she was very fond of him, but he did push my father. He would not let my father get away with anything of being too tired or too old or anything, because he'd show him up. You see, you mean you can't lift that? Come on, lift it out. He was just a big rugged head. Uncle Charlie, then subsequently through the years, I saw less and less of him, obviously, after I moved away from the family, but he became a writer of a newspaper column, if you can believe it. It was distributed in some about 100 weekly newspapers. I've forgotten the name of it, like Uncle Charlie's Corner or something like that, or Charlie's Corner, they call it. And I have a pack of his material, and it's most fascinating. And half of his poetry, all this poetry that he wrote in there. But it's witty, down-home type poetry. But he had this large following, and his goal was to live to be 100, and he didn't quite make it. At 97, he fell off a horse and died. You say it laughingly because he wouldn't have it any other way. He said, well, I didn't make it, or whatever. But that was his goal, and that shows you the degree of relative health he had at 97. He was out riding a horse. I mean, not just walking him, but I mean riding it, this kind of thing. And he was self-supporting all through those years. He didn't make millions of money, but he had a wonderful, wonderful time. That was Uncle Charlie. And so you had that penetration. Then in our other family entourage, with my father going to Europe on these tours every summer, we would go to Wabash, Indiana, where I was born. And here was my grandmother, who was a doctor, rather short woman, looked remarkably like our psychologist here, Rita Warren. Great similarity in facial structure and everything else. Anyway, staying at my grandmother's house in Wabash was quite an event, and a very welcome. We'd go and stay for 2 weeks because of several factors, but some of them were kind of peculiar. My grandmother had her office in her residence, and she had her office laboratory in the kitchen, and things got kind of mixed up in terms of what happened in the kitchen. So a lot of the food came out with a sort of a carbolic acid smell, taste to it, But you put up with that in order to have the rest of it. And I had some fascinating things take place in those summers, and it was an annual summer event where we would go. And to show you what about my mother, we would drive from Lexington, Kentucky, up to northern Indiana to Wabash, and my mother would do the driving. And this was an exciting event. We packed, vetted the food to go along, big deal. And we went across on a ferry at Louisville to go across into Indiana. And this was all just an exciting trip. And the other end of it, of course, was that I obviously got to know some kids in Wabash. And we were talking about my liking little girls. This was heaven over there, because I had on one side of the house, each my age, was a beautiful red-headed girl, and the other side was a beautiful, long, dark-haired girl, brown-haired girl. And they vied for my affection, or my attention is a better way to put it. And so this was, you had a real nice place for a kid to be. And I'm 10, 11 years old, I'm talking about the area over there. But this was that look-forward-ism to and I got kidded about it, and I took it very, not even defensively. I said, sure, because it was one of those things that went on. And a lot of adventurous stuff took place in Wabash. And again, my mother didn't know about this, but this other boy, not the girls, this other boy and I went to this carnival one evening, which was a typical carny thing, you know, tent shows and stuff. And we went to this hoochie coochie one, you know, we couldn't resist that. And there were the usual undulating girls with a tom-tom beat inside the tent. We paid our 10 cents to get in to see this. And we were sort of kind of, they weren't particularly pretty girls or everything else. And we were kind of disappointed because we thought, oh, that's all we get for our 15 cents. I can remember that very well. And then the guy says, he says, for another 10 cents, you can go in the back tent, and we have a special show. So we thought, as long as we're here, let's take the other 10 cents and go in, because we didn't have much left. So we went back into the back tent. And that's where I first saw my first naked woman was in that back tent. And so the woman stripped down the same drum, mind you, the same drum beat and everything. This one didn't have any clothes on. And after getting over the astonishment of seeing a naked woman, I don't say nude, because she was just raw naked in the sense that she wasn't that attractive. You'd think I was sexually aroused, not at all. You know what got me? She had a big appendix scar on the side, and I'm looking at this appendix scar all the time. Says, well, did you need to have one that big? You know, this type of thing. This big, huge, I assume it was an appendix scar. And I was looking at this long scarf. And so, and of course, I didn't tell my mother or my parents. So we, both of us, we wouldn't say we went in the back room. We just had a good time at the carnival. So these little pieces of fun on it. The other part, of course, was that earlier, one of the few times that my father came to Indiana with us, and I don't know the reason how that took place. And we couldn't have been about 6 or 7 year olds, and we were sitting out at twilight, sitting out in front of my grandmother's place, sort of an indentation, probably where a tree had come down, and was sort of an indentation where they'd taken the stump out. We're sitting around and they're telling ghost stories. Couldn't have been more than 20 feet from the porch, and my mother and grandmother and father were sitting on the porch, and we were telling those. And finally, probably I was the one who says, this isn't very exciting. Let's go up to the graveyard and tell the stories in the graveyard. And so all the rest of them, about 6 kids, you know. We said, sure, let's go. Okay, so we went across and up the street slowly and carefully. And we're hesitating, you know, hesitated a little bit. We took our time getting there. But we did get in and just went inside the graveyard, and here were all these, it's dark, you know, it's getting dark now, real dark. And here's a street light out of here, but we're inside where it's dark. And we're sitting there, and so we're starting to tell the stories again. And just after we'd been there a couple of minutes, all of a sudden this sound, ooh, like this, and we look, and here's this big ghostly figure coming out from behind this mausoleum back there and coming at us, waving these cloth-covered arms and this big head. Woo! Bang! We jumped and we ran like little bullets out of there fast. And I don't know whether I was the fastest one, but I was pretty close to the fastest one. We got back and here. Got back that way, so we really flew like that. Got back and think like, ghosts. I never, you know, we didn't really believe in ghosts, but there was real ghosts, honest goodness ghosts. We could see it. We all saw it, all heard it. And so after a while, we decided we'd get up the courage to go tell our parents, my father and mother, about it. We went on, my mother and grandmother were sitting there, and we told them about it. And my father came out from the house and came on the porch and says, what's the matter? He told him, he says, you were up there among all those ghosts. And he says, oh. And there was sort of this, no, we didn't see it, but I was told about it, this kind of knowing look between my mother and father. And I heard about it about a year later, and I didn't get mad at all. My father, having heard us plan to do this, had gone in the house, gotten a sheet, and gone out the back way and gone over the graveyard ready to be the ghost, you see. That was my first encounter with the supernatural, my father.
Your parents and even your relatives were nonconformists at that time, or not so much that perhaps, but people who were themselves. They didn't want to be like cookie cutter people. They were real people.
Yes, they were, and that was the sort of the facet that was kind of interesting. I kind of felt that we were different from our neighbors. That's the feeling, but I couldn't ever properly identify it. And my parents did not necessarily socialize with our neighbors across the way. I played with the boys, the Stevens boys, whose father ran a lumber yard. But my parents did not socialize with them, with their father and mother. There were about 3 couples, but none of them in our neighborhood that my father and mother did associate with. And so there was that funny feeling of being different, but not really knowing why there was that difference. It was very strange. It may have been because of the fact that the other people were very strictly in our neighborhood, strictly middle class. Because they were with the storekeepers, the people in that general category. When my mother and father were not, there must have been something like, here's the dentist down the road, and I played with the dentist's son, but my mother and father never associated with the dentist's parents. And I keep going around those. I played with the son of the local Chevrolet dealer, but my parents never associated. I don't think they even knew him. You see, there was not that type of neighborliness, although this was a very warm and friendly neighborhood, but it just didn't seem to work out that way. And yet I had the feeling that these other neighbors associated with each other. It was very, very strange. But you can see childhood is a kind of a peculiar mix, and somehow this might give a picture of what my childhood was like, because I certainly can say without any limitation that my childhood ended when in 1929 my father got an offer to become a professor at Ohio State in the Romance Language Department. And I presume, based on the information I had, that he was earning more than $80,000 plus a year in this whole tourist business. And he took away that possibility to a very large degree to accept a $6,000 a year salary. And I know that figure at Ohio State as a professor, and why he did it. Very simple reason. He said that in the spring of 1929, he said, and it took a lot of pressure on him to make this a fact, that this tourist business and the whole economy that supports it is not going to exist much longer, and now is the time to get into something secure. And over the anguished protests of us children, especially, my mother reluctantly agreed with my father. He accepted the post at Ohio State, and we moved there in the summer of 1929, and you had the crash in 29, which he quite accurately predicted in March of 1929. So that move to Ohio and the cold northern city of Columbus from that warm southern town really did mark the end of my childhood. That was the end of it. From then on, I became something else, but not a child anymore.
If you'd like to hear other Mobius tape discussions with Mr. Monroe, or learn more about the Institute's activities, write or phone the Monroe Institute, Faubourg, Virginia, 22938. The phone number is area code 804-361-1252. We hope you have enjoyed your listening. Thank you.